Okay, good evening, everyone. How are you? I'm just getting situated here. I just ran in the door. I was playing on a Bach birthday celebration this afternoon, so just got home from that. I'm just letting people in from the waiting room so we get going here and we'll get started in just a second. And if I can just ask everybody to mute their microphones if they don't have them muted, just those noise issues. Thank you so much. Okay, thank you. All right. Nice to see everyone today here. Thank you for being here this afternoon or this evening, I guess, depending on where you are. And see some familiar faces and some new names. So, always happy to interact with everyone. So, thanks for being here today. Um, As always, I love questions. So at any point in time, if you do have questions, you can just go ahead and put them in the chat box. You can give them verbally later on if you'd like to, but if you're thinking of something, um, sorry, can everyone hear me okay? You're having it? Okay. Let me just check one thing on my settings. Sorry about that. Sometimes microphones decide to uh, is that better? Good. Okay. Sorry about that. Sometimes the microphone turns itself down without me knowing it. Okay. So if you do have questions at any point in time, you can go ahead and put them in the chat box or we'll have time to answer them directly later. So today's topic is all about practicing and specifically slow practice because slow practice is probably talked about amongst all musicians, right? And although it's obviously an effective tool, it might not always be the most efficient and effective tool in all circumstances. So I think we need to think about when it's helpful, why it's helpful, and what are some potential drawbacks from it. It sounds like a very good thing to do, of course, right? To practice slowly, take your time, be careful. Of course, it's never like a dangerous or reckless thing to do. But I think we can think about it a little further and discuss some of these issues. So first things first, everyone is different, right? So everyone has different learning processes. Everyone has their way their mind works, the way they organize things, the way they relate to things and people. So I'm going to give you some ideas, and it might not be that my ideas work for you or your ideas would work for me, right? So that's why we share ideas so that we can find our best way. So in all cases and situations, we really need to know ourselves very well and know how we learn. I have to say that I'm a very fast-paced mind. If I try to practice slowly, I get very, very distracted and it's not efficient for me at all. It's basically like a big waste of time. So I almost never practice very slowly. Unless it's something like just extremely difficult and I'm trying to figure out, but I usually spend time on it in a different way. But that's me. I know myself. I'm not going to say that you should never practice something slowly. But just that I know that about myself and I have to work accordingly so I don't basically waste my own time or cause inefficient practicing habits with myself. Of course, there was a point in time where I probably did practice things a little bit more slowly than I do now. But that was something that I always thought about when this idea of practicing slowly was discussed. It was like, really, is it the best practice? So in general, why do we practice, right? So I find that these days, especially as we get busier and we have too many things to do, right? Practicing can tend to be very transactional. We practice because we have to prepare for something, whether that be a concert or a lesson or, a gig or whatever, your grandma's funeral or a wedding or whatever. We practice because we have something coming up, right? So ultimately, we want our practice to reflect not only the short term, but the long term, I think. So why should we practice? First, we want to learn the language of music. Our lifelong pursuit of studying music is to really be as versed in the language as possible. If you've been in my classes before, I've always said, if someone asks you if you speak more than one language, you should always say yes. Because if you're a musician, you speak the language of music also, and it's a very broad and diverse language, right? But was something that we're constantly honing in on and discovering over our lifetimes. So that's number one, I think, something that we always want to be thinking about when we practice. Secondly, we're trying to build skill on the instrument, right? This is very important. Even if you really, really understand the language of music very well and you don't have the skill necessary to make that happen on your instrument, then it's not going to be very effective in terms of your performance, right? So we're practicing to build that skill. We're practicing also to build trust and confidence in our skills. That comes from the repetition, and not just solely from repetition, but spending a good amount of time with something, and you're building that trust and confidence. And we're building that trust and confidence not just by doing, but from understanding what we're doing. We've talked about this before. We don't want to practice only to do. We want to practice to understand. Now, that's going to be both with your instrument. That might be really understanding the balance of your finger movements or the exchange of energy in your fingerings. That might be in the music, really having a solid comprehension of what the music is doing. That could be, from the harmony or the rhythm or whatever. So we're building that confidence and understanding through our study both of the instrument and the music itself. We want to create efficient processes. That's another reason why we practice, right? Sometimes we like to waste time if we're, just relaxing and having maybe a cocktail on the beach or something like that. That's a nice waste of time. But I don't think when we're trying to prepare something that most of us really want to be wasting time, right? Especially these days, we're quite busy. So we want to build efficient practices, not only just for time's sake, but we want to make sure our outcome matches the effort that we're producing. Another thing we practice for is to remove limitations, right? So as I said, if you are really wanting to express something that you feel that you understand through the music, but you don't quite have the aptitude or the skill to do so on the instrument, then you have a limitation, right? So that's one reason we practice, is so that we can be as free as we would like to be able to express those musical ideas in a confident manner. We practice to learn to communicate effectively. I think a lot of our practice, we're focusing on taking in the information, right? But we also need to focus on how we put out the information. That's very important, because that's how we connect with others. So that's what's challenging about it, because we are kind of taking in and transmitting information at the same time, And I also think we practice to enjoy ourselves, right? We should at least be enjoying ourselves to some extent when we practice. Now, it's not always a barrel of fun 100% of the time. Sometimes we have to play things we might not enjoy as much, or something is very challenging, or, it can seem tedious. sometimes, but we should also be enjoying ourselves, and we want to do that when we practice. So, in general, now this is probably a topic for another class, all about warming up and stuff like that, but even before you begin a practice session, I think it's really important. We talk a lot about warming up in the physical sense, but I think it's really important to warm up your spirit. And that can mean many different things to different people. Maybe you want to look at some beautiful artwork before, or maybe you have a poem that really resonates with you, or maybe looking at fashion or whatever really resonates with you that gets you inspired. Maybe it's listening to actual music. I think we want to be in a good frame of mind when we go into a practice session, if we're really going to sit down for a long time and spend that time practicing. I've talked about this in other classes as well. Personally, I don't think we should shut out the world around us too much when we're practicing. That means, like, if you're practicing at school, like blocking the windows so no one can see you and all that kind of thing. I think we want to be careful of isolating ourselves too much, because as artists, as performers, most of the time our goal again is to communicate with other people through this art, through this music. So when we practice, for me, the idea of concentration and focus is to really be in the present moment, right? So in your practice, in the present moment, you might see people walking outside or talking or laughing. That can also be used as inspiration, not just as like a distraction, right? So again, everyone works a little bit differently. I know that if I try to shut the world out too much, I actually get very distracted by it because it feels very unnatural to me. Because in no other point in time in my life is it like that. I'm not like completely alone trying to block out everyone. There's always someone around or people around, or even if I'm at my home alone, I can hear the neighbor's dog outside. I can hear things going on around me, right? So for me, being conscious and being in that present moment and allowing those things to be in your space will actually make it much easier too when you're going to perform and you have distractions of all kinds around you, whether that be someone coughing in the theater or someone sitting in the front row swiveling their leg or something like that that might be distracting you when you're playing. I think those distractions will become less bothersome if you let your natural environment be a part of your practice session. I practice most of the time if I'm at home with the TV on, for example. I know about myself that my conscious will focus much better if my subconscious is occupied. If my subconscious is not occupied, I'll just be alone with my thoughts in my head of all these things I need to do, and then I get just, kind of distracted by that. So I know that works for me. I've done that since since I played the flute. And I get very distracted by silence. So I know that about myself. I know that works for me. I'm not telling you all you have to practice with the TV on. I'm just saying that there can be different ways that can work for different people. What works for the majority of people usually is the opposite for me. Even like NyQuil makes me awake and things like that. So I'm just kind of a funny case in most ways in that way. But in any case, there's a variety of different ambiance and environments that you can make for yourself in your practice session. And I would suggest not to do it the same way every time also. Because that's another limitation, right? If you're getting used to just playing in the same space all the time. Now, I know if you're in school, this can be challenging because, most of the time you have to practice in the practice rooms at school. But I always encourage my own students to try to move around the building and practice in various spaces. If you can kind of beg, cheat, and steal to get a larger room or another space, you might even just sneak into the stairwell while no one's there, if it's a closed off stairwell, and play in there for a little bit just to get a different feeling, a different space, because you can get kind of locked into playing in one kind of space. Even if you're in your own home, move around. We all have rooms that we like more than others, but sometimes it's good to practice in those rooms that we maybe aren't quite as comfortable in, to see how that affects us. Because again, we are practicing, most of the time for our end result, which might be a performance in most cases, and we don't always get ideal circumstances and performances. Okay, now let's talk a little bit more about learning languages. So I don't know if besides English and music, I'm sure we have other people in here that speak more languages than that. Or at least many of you have probably dabbled in learning another language, at least at a minimal level. So when we're learning another language, what are some of the things that we're learning? Well, we learn the fundamentals of the language. That could be the alphabet, if it's a different kind of alphabet. Maybe there's different kinds of accents, those kinds of things. Understanding the sounds, that's a big part of learning a language, right? Grammar, sentence structure, verb tenses, all of that kind of thing. So what are some of the best practices for learning a language? Well, immersion, that's a really good practice. I know that the languages that I speak the best, I speak several, are the ones that I learned by just being there in the other country and just speaking the language directly, not ones that I took a class for. I think the language I took a class for the most was French, and I can't really speak French whatsoever. But the ones that I didn't study at all formally are the ones that I can speak the best, just from being immersed in it. So in order to be immersed in it, you of course have to listen to it, right? So say you're in another country and you have some extra time, you can turn that TV on and you can watch soap operas or whatever. These days on Netflix, you can watch all sorts of kinds of programs in other languages. So that's a really great way to get your ear tuned into that language. You can't be afraid, right? So you have to have some conversation in that language. And I think that we're not as afraid to make maybe mistakes, when we're having these conversations. I mean, no one wants to make mistakes, but you have to get it going sometime, right? So you have conversation. Then, of course, reading the language, listening. So we use all of these kinds of forms of studying the language. So this all applies to music as well. So let's talk about, just practicing slowly. So when we start to learn a new language, assuming that it's basically the same alphabet, it might not be, but assuming that it's a language that follows basically the same alphabet as English language, if you're a native English speaker, you still know what those letters sound like. They might have a slightly different sound, but you usually learn that pretty quickly. I don't think that when we first start having conversations or just saying even like basic things, like say we're speaking Spanish and we say like buen dia or buenas noches, we don't say buenas noches. We don't sound out every syllable, right? That's not generally how the human being learns things. Like part of that learning is how we learn how things flow together. But when we learn music, we tend to learn things like we're learning all the individual sounds, like the individual notes when we practice slowly. We always want to, as we learn music, sounds funny, learn it in a musical way. And I oftentimes that musicians kind of woodshed through a passage, so they kind of learn the notes And then they say, well, I'll add the music later. And that's, we can't arbitrarily decide what's going on with the music, after we learned the notes. That's like saying, okay, I'm going to learn the letters, but I'm going to add the sounds later. If you're learning a language, that you're kind of disconnecting yourself from the actual language. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but that's what we tend to do with music. So that's something that I think that we want to be careful about. I also think that when you see a language, after you know it reasonably well, even if it's relatively new, you know how it's supposed to sound in your head. And when you see it written down, it's confirming that, right? That's ultimately what we want to get at when we look at music. That when we see it, we can hear it immediately. Like when we see a group of notes, we hear it like a word. We hear how that sound comes together. And what we see is confirming what we hear in our head. One thing I do think that we might want to kind of slow down, not necessarily always the music itself, but the feeling that we don't have any time to practice, right? As I said, we're really busy and that kind of thing. Um, Even if you only have 5 or 10 minutes, and oftentimes in my day, that's about the amount of time I have to practice, depending on all the other different things that I have to be doing. I want to practice like I have all the time in the world, you know. Even if it's just like playing one note and discovering as many possibilities as I can on one note, that will probably um, that will probably do me a lot more good than just kind of frantically trying to accomplish something, in those 5 minutes. So I think, again, as I mentioned at the beginning, we are a little bit transactional about practicing, and we're always practicing like for a lesson or a concert or so on and so forth. We want to practice just for the sake of the betterment of what we're doing. And I know that can be hard to do when we have so many things going on, right? So I think that's one thing that we can kind of slow down, and to recognize that it's a lifelong goal, because, as I said, the language of music is quite broad, right? Okay, so let's talk about, since it seems like I'm knocking on practicing slowly, I'm not. There are benefits, of course, of practicing slowly. When you start to practice slowly, you have more time for organization and coordination. So again, it's really important to think when you are practicing slowly why you are doing that. And you're just giving yourself more time to organize. That is extremely important. Pitch organization, coordination, that's also maybe something in the fingers, but fingers don't move by themselves, so you're ultimately coordinating something in your brain. And if you've practiced efficiently in your technical exercises, we assume that you have a reasonable skill level, right? So one thing that you can determine while you are practicing slowly is if you are having an issue, is it an issue of comprehension? That's your understanding of the music or how you're seeing the music, hearing the music, or is it an error of skill? Is it your fingers, really don't like to coordinate between the left and the right hand? Or are you just not maybe grouping notes or phrasing notes in a certain way that helps your fingers to be guided? So we want to be determining that as we're practicing slowly, not just kind of going through the motions like, oh, I'm doing what I'm supposed to do, I'm practicing it slowly. We really want to be trying to figure that out in that amount of time. You also have more time to listen to yourself when you practice slowly. I think this is especially important for sound quality. Now, if you're working on maybe an etude or something like that, and you're working to get a homogeneous tone quality in all registers, then practicing more slowly will help you to really listen for that. And when I mean homogeneous, I don't mean like a monotonous one kind of tone quality. I just mean in quality. So if you're playing something with octaves, is the lower note balancing the upper note, that kind of thing. If you practice more slowly, you have a little bit more time to listen for that. So personally, I find practicing slowly more beneficial for those kind of things, for more time to listen, than the comprehension things. Because, as I said, when we learn to read, we don't read individual letters. We don't say, today I want to go to the... We don't read like that. We learn to read in groups. So we're going to get to that aspect of it in a bit. So another thing, maybe you're working on your vibrato, and you want to make sure you're being very thoughtful about how the vibrato is supporting the musical line. So you might slow it down a little bit just to listen to see if you're really making a connection through the notes, rather than just on the notes themselves, if you desire that with your vibrato, something like that. That might be another reason. Maybe you're listening for articulation. What's really happening with the articulation? A note has a beginning, a middle, and an end, right? So maybe you want to play a little bit more slowly to really see what part of that you could make a little bit better if you're desiring to make something a little bit more clear. Is it the front of the note? Is it the sound of the note, the middle of the note, or is it the end of the note? That could be another reason to practice slowly. Maybe you want to listen to the ends of the notes in the room that you're playing in to see how they react, and see if you can really listen to how they're resonating in the room. That could be another good reason to practice slowly. So if you want your articulation to be very vibrant, maybe I'm going to play... Now, I don't need to practice it slowly for evenness, but I want to listen for style, so I'm going to practice it for that reason. To see if I can really maintain that when I get at a faster tempo. So those could be some of the really good benefits of practicing slowly, is for more time for active listening. Active listening should be a major part of your practice session at all times. I joke with my students, I think that sometimes we practice from here forward because we're so focused at looking at what's in front of us, and we're focused on going forward, that we forget to practice from back here and include the ears at all times. So that active listening is super important. So yes, when you slow things down, you have more time for active listening. That's always a bonus. Now, what are some potential pitfalls of practicing slowly? Well, again, if you practice slowly for comprehension in a note-by-note way, this can cause you to kind of reinvent the wheel for every piece, because you're not looking for those patterns, those cells, those processes, right? So that's something that we want to be careful about. That we don't, this goes for sight reading as well. Sometimes when we get a new piece, we feel like, oh, I've never seen this before, and we freak out, right? But I don't think anybody freaks out when they get a new book. You haven't seen those words and that configuration before, but you've seen all those words before. You've seen all those letters before. It's the same thing with music. Same exact thing. So that is something that I think we have to recognize, that our human learning processes, I don't think are different for, speaking or learning music, or they don't have to be. I think it's just kind of how they're taught to us initially, right? So sometimes as we progress on, or the older we get, we realize that there's a lot more connection in what we do, or there should be, right? Because things don't need to be complicated to be good. And in fact, you don't want them to be complicated if you want them to be efficient. Again, as I mentioned, I think one thing that can happen when we practice slowly is if we learn the notes outside of a musical context. That's what I mentioned. If we're just kind of like woodshedding and we're not really thinking about like the musical gesture, what is the expression of the passage. For me, that is so important when I'm practicing. I can't practice in a different way. I can't disconnect myself from that. That's almost like impossible to me. I find particularly, I know with my students or with students in general, when they slow things down, they only are slowing down the actual speed of what they're doing, but they don't adjust the stylistic things that they're doing to that tempo. So it's really important that if you are practicing more slowly, that you're adjusting everything. And that would be like the note releases, for example, if you're playing like Mozart concerto and you played under tempo. I still want the ends of the notes to have like an uplifted, energetic character. So if I'm practicing slowly and I'm just for sound quality maybe, but I'm not really thinking about the end of the note in that tempo. So I sped it up, but I kept the same quality of all parts of the note. It wasn't just one aspect. So again, I think we want to make sure that when we practice it slowly, we're really practicing how we want it to be when it is faster in all ways, and that those things translate over always. Another thing we want to be careful about is when we're practicing slowly is to not practice outside of a rhythmic context. Sometimes we try something, it could be, I don't know, what I was just playing. Maybe we're just thinking about the articulation, and I did it like 3 times, but I wasn't really like in a rhythmic cycle, If I do something like that and I repeat, usually I'll put at least a measure rest in between. That time I didn't, but it's for time's sake right now. But normally I'd put at least a measure rest in between. Why do I do that? Because I want time to reevaluate and reflect on what I did and if it was good or if I wanted it to be better. Now, if it's good, I'm going to actually try to repeat it a few more times, maybe 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 more times to see if I can keep that quality. I think we tend to practice, we get it wrong, probably more times than we get it correctly. And then we get it correct and then we move correctly once and then we move on, right? So we're actually used to hearing ourselves play it incorrectly, So you want to make sure that you're practicing to hear yourself sounding good. That's really important. Now, I've talked about this before, and if you know me, one of my ways of practicing is listening to myself in a sort of obsessive way. So if I have recordings of myself and they're very good, I listen to them a lot because I want to get used to hearing myself sound like that. Because if I'm really used to hearing myself sound like that, that's like hearing the sound of my voice. I can trust it when it's going to come out, because that's the only way I can hear myself. So even if I'm a little nervous or a little thrown off by something, that sound that I have is so ingrained, that sound of hearing myself, it's just like I just connect with that and I can kind of just let go of everything else. So that's another way that we can practice. One thing that we tend to do when we're practicing slowly to fast and we try to speed it up is that we run toward the pulse. So we have a tendency that when we have to play faster, we play sooner. So again, if I take Mozart, and I start to rush and I start to lose that rhythmic integrity. So most of the times when we get faster, we want to play later, as late as possible without being late, right? So I actually sped up like quite a few clicks, but it didn't seem like I was speeding up because I kept the rhythmic integrity. That's something super important, that faster doesn't mean sooner. So one way to kind of test your musical reflexes, rather than, putting the metronome, say you start at 60 and then you click up to 64 and up to 68 and you're just kind of clicking up. I think it's good to start at whatever your tempo is, say it's 60. Go up to 72, then maybe go down to 66, go up to 80, go down to 80, go down to 76, go up to 88, and so on and so forth. So you're testing your musical reflexes to see how you can adjust up and down, not kind of only going in one direction. One thing I think that is really important to remember is that actually there's only one tempo. And what I mean by that is the kind of division of a pulse gives the speed inside a pulse, right? So if you're practicing at 60 or 120 or 188, the notes inside of the beat should have the same proportion on the division. So if you're really thinking about the tempo of the division, the proportion of the division of that note, so you have 16th notes, faster and faster and faster or slower or whatever, but I'm keeping the same proportion on the division. So if you do what I said just a moment ago, you play sooner, you do I'm starting to rush out of the gate. I'm putting the second note too soon. So that's what I mean about one tempo. There's only one way proportionally to divide that space to make it even. So that's the thing that we need to discover. And if you can discover that and you have that really down, I promise you it's pretty easy to play at whatever tempo you want. That's kind of the secret to it. So that's super, super important. Okay, now some other little practice solutions. I know we've people talk a lot about practicing in different rhythms. That's very helpful, for evenness and that kind of thing. I have a little thing I'm going to pull up here. Let's see if I can get that going. Okay, is everybody seeing my PDF? This is just from a little kind of handbook that I did. So the first thing here is groupings and patterns. That's very obvious, right? So we always want to look for groups and patterns. There's two examples here from a Telemann sonata. And sometimes we get overwhelmed by seeing a lot of notes on the page, but we need to remind ourselves many times that there might be a lot of notes, but there might not be that many pitches, right? So in this pattern here, how many pitches are there? Well, there's G in octaves, and then D, and then C. So there's really only 4 pitches, right? So, things like that. Or the next one, you have the repeated little half step gesture. So that's just a very obvious example of that. So we always want to be looking for groups and patterns, asking ourselves, like, in those passages that look like they have a lot of notes, is it really a lot of notes, or is it just, how many pitches are there? And then sometimes having one, like, real central pitch to relate to, like in that first case, that would be G, like hearing the interval, the C to G, and then the D to G, like making sure you're relating that, rather than focusing on, like, the very wide jump, but you're focusing on kind of a home base note. That's very helpful. Now, the next example is from one of our favorite flute pieces, the Chaminade Concertino. I'm sure we've all played that or heard it at some point, right? So here's an example of runs. I don't let my students use that term runs because they usually sound messy because they're just playing whatever, running away from the notes. So I just say it's a scale or an arpeggio or something like that. A lot of times it'll just be a lot of notes and they'll call them runs. In this case, they're kind of like a run because it's a fluid stretch of notes. But the first one is a descending D major scale. Then a C major scale, and then D major again. Right, okay. Now, I group them. The first one is grouped, I think, 3, 4, 4, and then 4, 4, 4. And then the last one I grouped in groups of 3. Now, that was just a very obvious example. You could also, for example, take that very last run, in quotes, and you could make the first note kind of in phrase 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1. So you're phrasing only like the downward intervals, so. So you're phrasing also by 3, but it's from the second note. So it would be the C, B, A, and then the G, F sharp, E, and so on and so forth. You don't have to do it right from the beat. And most of the time when we have groupings, we do want to find a way to phrase over the pulse. So if it's like a great example of that, if you know the V-dur suite, the second movement, has recurring sextuplets, and oftentimes you hear like a hole at the end of the pulse, right? So if it were in that case, and a good resource for reading about that is William Kincaid's book, Kincaidana. It's actually John Krell that wrote that book about William Kincaid. Of course, it was principal flute of Philadelphia Orchestra back in the day. He talks all about that, note groupings and things like that. But if I have groups of 6 notes, normally I would phrase 1, 2, 3, and then 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3. So 4, 5, 6, go to 1, 2, 3. So you're creating a cycle. And when you have cycles, things tend to be a little bit more fluid. Chunking. I'm sure you've heard that term. So this actually is usually almost more beneficial than practicing slowly in a lot of cases. So here's a section from Peter and the Wolf. So you might set your metronome on basically what your tempo would be. I don't have my metronome handy right now, but let's say it's about 132 or something, you're practicing about that speed. I might just practice 4 notes to the next group, right? Most of us can manage 4 notes at a time. So just really focusing on the evenness of the rhythm of those 4 notes, landing on the next beat. In a rhythmic context, of course. Then you might go to the next beat. Something like that. So you're working on smaller parts, but recognizing those smaller parts as a unit. That's very important. So on and so forth. Now, another way that you could do this, I don't have this written down in here, but is practice back to front. Now, you can literally play the passage backwards, Something like that. You can literally play it backwards, and you might have to do that a little bit more slowly at first to get the hang of it, of course, right? But that forces you to kind of look at it in a different way, from a visual vantage point, and that always can be helpful. And then the other thing you can do is literally play it, you know, back to front. So you play the last note, and then maybe you're going to do just the last 2 16th notes as like a pickup. You know, you might add 2 16ths at a time. That way you're really practicing the ending really, really rhythmically, starting from the ending. Because sometimes we start from the beginning and the ending kind of gets like, you know, just the crumbs of our energy, you know. So practicing from back to front, so you work your way back to the beginning. And again, you must do this in a really good rhythmic context, or else it's not really useful. So I want to stress that. So that's another method that you can use for working out some technical issues. You can stop, you know, on different notes, like and if you notice, I'm making sure to always put the inflection on the beat. For example, I'm not doing like going to the last note. I'm going to the note that falls on the beat. And it's not really an accent per se. It's just making sure the rhythm inflection goes in the right place. And when you play it all together, you can smooth it out. You know, a little faster. You know, which sometimes it can be quite fast depending on what kind of conductor you have, you know. So if you have that rhythmic integrity again, and you break that down and you really know where the inflections are and where the energy is bouncing off of the pulses, you're going to have a pretty good technical control of it. Obviously practicing the rhythms. Here's a passage from the Ibarra Flute Concerto. I call this Imagine That. So we're going to take out notes. We're going to play it in tempo, but take out various notes. So the passage goes, right? So first we're just going to play in tempo, in a good tempo with a metronome, hopefully. Just the first notes. Then we'll do the first and second. Then the first and third. And so on. And then just the second and third. Then just the third. Again, so you're practicing the rhythmic integrity of the passage, and you're practicing having to look at the notes from different vantage points, right? Because it looks like it's in groups of 3, but is it, right? Because it's third in groups of 3, but it makes more sense to, again, phrase over the pulse. Now, we're going to put their articulation where the music says so, but in our mind, we're going to group them differently. Because that's going to make it flow forward a little bit more easily. So, those are just a few different ways that you can practice, you know. Let me stop my screen share now. Practice other than just, you know, going slow and doing one thing at a time. So just for time's sake, I'm gonna look at the questions now. So if you do have questions, make sure to pop them into the chat. Let's see what we have here. How do we deal with music that is demanding for people who aren't super advanced, where we have to develop the coordination? Is that work that should be done in technical exercises as opposed to the rep? Yes. I mean, in any case, you know, you're kind of only as good as your basics, right? So now we all have different purposes of what we're playing, why we're playing, and some of us are doing it more for fun. Some of us have a job, So, for example, if your job is to play in an orchestra, you're essentially a worker. And you're no different than a worker at Walgreens or CVS that needs to know how to do all the the codes at the cash register or whatever. These days you have automatic checkout. But say you're a barista at Starbucks. They got to know all those drinks. They got to know those. It's like we need to know the Beethoven recipes. We need to know the Mozart recipes. We need to know that stuff, right? So we like to think of ourselves as, high echelon, being musicians. And it's a very beautiful art form that we do. But if that's your job, you're a worker. So you got to really know your stuff in that way. Now, maybe you're not quite as advanced, and maybe you play for enjoyment, or you play in a amateur group that, maybe people that have other jobs, doctors or something like that love to play music or whatever. You can still have a really valuable experience. So you want to find ways that you can connect with the music that's relatable to you, and maybe relatable to things that you're doing, outside of music. I think when we find ways that we can kind of understand things on the most basic level, we tend to enjoy them more. But I definitely, no matter your level, would spend time on the fundamental aspects of it, because that's only going to make you have more fun, right? And that doesn't mean you have to spend hours and hours a day with method books, practice, plogging away on all that stuff, but just spending a few minutes of time really thinking about what you're doing. Like, okay, I'm gonna work on my vibrato. Maybe that's not something you work on a lot, but you want to get that better. Rather than thinking of it as like, oh, my teacher told me to do this and this and that, where it sounds kind of like a science project of stuff you do, maybe you want to say, well, who else uses vibrato? Well, let's see. String players use vibrato. Well, what would it look like if they were playing how I'm making the vibrato? Maybe trying to visualize that. Or singers use vibrato. How would I sing it? Would I sing it like, whoa, 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 whoa? Probably not, right? So you can think about things in your fundamentals that can relate to other stuff to work on that. But I do think it's kind of an important thing to do, no matter what level you're at. So
Can I ask a follow-up to
yeah,
that?
sure. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. It's just been so interesting. I guess, I do practice, I study with Matthew Allison,
Mhm.
and I'm an adult, obviously, over 60. I played a lot when I was a kid, and I've been playing for the last 4 years. But I play generally an hour of different tone, technical, all sorts of different things every day. But can I give myself permission to say, listen, I can't play the Prokofiev because yet, but can I go there and try to play it? That's what I'm trying to say. Or is that ineffective practice?
Well, what I might do is sit down, and we didn't get to talk about this as much as I wanted to for time, but of course, if you want to be doing something at a good level, you have to really have as much context as possible. You need to be studying the whole score. So, for someone, like you, I might suggest listening to all different kinds of recordings of it with the score, and that, for example, that Prokofiev, that such an iconic piece for us, right? And sometimes when we have these iconic pieces, we kind of build them, put them on a pedestal, and then when we practice them, we do weird stuff just because we're trying to play this thing and we know how it goes, right? So what you might be able to do to ease into that is okay, I'm going to take that opening line and I'm just going to practice it just with one note. I'm just going to play A and see if I can just play the rhythms in the line. Can I make a phrase just with the rhythm? And I would recommend that for anybody, if advanced or, and that's something that we can also do other than, again, changing the speed is can I practice it in tempo, but with a neutral pitch? So I'm going to practice the rhythm only and the flow and the phrasing of the music, but with a neutral pitch. And then you might make a neutral rhythm. Let's say, okay, I want to practice that beginning just for sound. So I'm going to play everything with a quarter note. Or whatever, just to really listen for that. So you might not be able to, like, if you feel like that piece is beyond you, you might not be able to play the whole thing exactly like you might like to do it, but you can certainly work on it in a way that is not gonna build bad habits just because you're the good part of what you want to do, the the eagerness of wanting to do it doesn't make you kind of hack away at it with a I know I did that when I was younger. I just wanted to play stuff and I just felt like I was hacking away at some of it just because I was so over eager to play it. So the great thing about being an older student, in that sense, or someone returning, is now you have more wisdom, right? You have more wisdom to say, okay, like, just hacking at this thing until I kind of get it might not be the best way to go about it. I can really work up this part of the piece. Maybe this is my challenge section, so I'm going to set that aside and I'm going to analyze that and see if there is a way that I can figure it out to make it work for me, something like that. So I think you're on mute. No, we lost it for some reason. Sorry about that. I don't know why it's not. Maybe if you, I can answer the next question maybe while you're working on that. So is chunking the grouping of notes in practice? Yeah, I'm unsure what chunking is. Yeah, so chunking is basically, it's not really my term, it's this term that's often used, is when you're just working on a smaller portion of notes, basically a chunk of notes in tempo, like I was demonstrating in the Pier and the Wolf. Usually you might work, say it's a group of 16th notes, you could do 4 notes at a time, then you can make it eight notes at a time, and then a whole bar. Then you might work on piecing together bars, then you might do 2 bars at a time with some rest in between. So it's taking smaller chunks of music in tempo and piecing them together. So your brain and your fingers and everything are processing in tempo, but in smaller pieces. Yeah. The high D, yeah. For the funny thing, the high D part is actually not as difficult as we might think it is. We're all focused on kind of getting up to that D. But the rhythm of the passage, the bar before, bum, ba-bum, ba-bum, has a dotted rhythm, right? And then it just has, if you focus on their 8th note rhythms, there's D's in the middle. And it goes up to the D's. And yes, it takes a little practice, but what's going to help you is maintaining that rhythm. And if you maintain the integrity of the dotted rhythm that happens in the bar before, ba, 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 da, 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 dum, ba, ba, da, 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 dum, ba, bum, 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 ba, bum, bum, bum. And the D's are always landing on the 8th notes. And you break it down and kind of figure it out that way. You just have to get the triplets in tempo and then, make sure you hit the D. But it's not as, crazy hard as you might think it is, right? If you kind of break it down and analyze it a little bit, it's more attainable and achievable, I think. Great. Any other questions for today? Yes, I am using La Freak. Yes, I always use them. It's kind of just part of my instrument. I always play with them even when I practice. So yeah, you can. If you have more questions about that, you can find it all online. I've written about it and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, it's just kind of part of my instrument. Great. Okay. Any other questions? So again, I don't want to tell everybody that I think practicing slowly is not a good idea. Of course, that's not the purpose of this. It's just that there are other ways that you can go about it too. And we want to make sure that our slow practice is really efficient, conscious, thoughtful, that we're actively listening when we do that. We're really organizing and planning, but eventually you got to be in the pace. It's just like walking, we plan our steps basically, but it's kind of second nature, right? So we want some of these processes that we can, do musically to become second nature as well. Okay, wonderful. So I don't think we have any more questions. Thanks again, everyone, for joining. We'll be doing more of these classes, so just be on the lookout for them. And I hope everyone has a good rest of the month. We're almost to April. I can't believe that, right? So we'll see you sometime next month. Take care. Bye.